All right, so welcome everybody. Nice to see you here. As you saw in the email, this is going to be the final webinar of our GlobeDrought project learning series, because the project is going to end this year. And I can see recognize some of the names in the list of participants. So thank you for following us through this webinar. And if you are here for the first time, I'd like to remind you that you can always find all the recordings of the past webinars on the learning platform. So today, as you can see, droughts in the context of the post-2015 integrated approach to managing droughts. And for that, we have as speakers Emmanuel, Cheo, UNU-EHS, Stefanski, and here's Tsegai. Okay, sorry, I see that maybe my volume is a bit low. Speak up. So yeah, but with that, I would like to hand over to my colleague Emmanuel to give the first presentation. And after, just to remind you, in the end, we will have some time for Q&A and a discussion. If you have any questions, ask them.
Okay, thank you very much, Yannick. I'm sure, as you have heard, my name is Ambe Emmanuel Cheo. I work with the United Nations University Institute of Environment and Human Security in Bonn, Germany. I have a background in water management and from the Technical University in Cottbus. I studied in the Technical University in Cottbus. So today I'll be giving a presentation on a very broad topic, but I will try to make it simple and kind of make it understandable at the end, which looks at ensuring coherence in policy and practice within the context of our drought and the post-2015 agenda. And the learning objective of this presentation is to highlight synergies in the post-2015 agenda. When I'm talking of post-2015 agenda, I'm referring to the Paris Agreement, the Standard Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Sustainable Development Goals. The second learning objective is more or less to enhance coherence. How can we enhance coherence between these different documents to ensure a kind of a more effective drought management, since it is the focus of today's webinar session? And finally, the last learning objective for this presentation is more or less what are some of the benefits when we ensure coherence between these different international agreements. What are some of the commonalities, the obstacles that are observed in enhancing or in ensuring coherence? And finally, the pathways, which kind of pathways do we have to create coherence? The post-2015 agenda of or maybe the period after the post-2015 saw the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the Standard Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, this is a very broad framework or international agreement, which we can later on elaborate. But the common ground for all these three international agreements is to reduce vulnerability and as well as to enhance resilience within communities. It is fair enough to say also that there are other international agreements, such as the New Urban Agenda or the Agenda for Humanity, which also looks at reducing vulnerability as well as enhancing resilience. But I think the peculiarity of these three, Paris Agreement, the Standard Framework, and the Sustainable Development Goal, is that they deal directly with extreme events and disaster. So so all the developmental or all international agreement ensure or promotes the integration as well as cohesion between climate change adaptation and as well as disaster risk reduction. So what is the rationale behind enhancing coherence between these different international agreements? As we know, climate change poses challenges in achieving the sustainable development goals. This also has an impact in the nature of weather-related hazards, such as drought or flooding, as we have noticed in recent times, whereby we have a kind of frequent occurrence as well as the intensity. The intensity of the occurrence of these extreme events or weather events have also increased in most recent time. So ensuring coherence between the implementation of this different international agreement further strengthen the resilience of the local communities where these hazards are occurring. It also strengthens the economy and also their natural resources, which builds a very strong argument why there is a need to look at these three different international agreements in a more holistic approach. So sometimes we are tempted to think that that the Paris Agreement that focus on climate change adaptation or on climate change issue, and the standard framework that focus on disaster risk reduction and sustainable development that ensure the overall sustainability, different entities, which looking at this slide shows that there is a window for integration, especially when we think of the recent increase of the frequency of these events and also their intensity. Give a kind of a strong argument why we should be coherence between these three different international agreements in terms of implementation and also in terms of allocation of international funding mechanism to ensure that these different international agreements are implemented at the national level. So what are some of the commonalities which foster coherence between these different international agreements, especially when we think of climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction? Both of them are risk and uncertainty focus. They also the risk component, which look at what is the hazard, what are the exposed elements, which community or what are the assets that are vulnerable, what is the capacity, the resilient capacity of this community, and what are the risk drivers needs to be understood before even thinking of designing an effective measure for resolving such a hazard. And finally, the third commonality of this different international agreement is the risk governance component, which is the enabling element for achieving success. So based on this, I mean, there is a kind of a strong argument why coherence and the kind of mutual reinforcement is a more sensible approach for strengthening the resilience of communities and nations. So the key benefit of ensuring coherence between these different documents or international framework is that there is a more effective policy and investment, especially when you are designing your developmental plan and policy. It is also more effective in terms of using your capacity and your financial resources. And also it advances there is a more advanced technical knowledge and expertise in assessing or understanding mitigation risks, both climate and non-climate risk. And finally, there is an enhanced disaster preparedness and response plan, because the resources are more focused, and the resources are more focused in terms of approaching non-climate or climate risk. And obstacles why coherence is sometimes difficult to be achieved. It's basically because of the perception that the focus is different. I mean, often people in the climate change adaptation are tempted to think that disaster risk is more, or disaster risk reduction is more focused on disaster response or disaster response or risk management. But with the involvement of the standard framework, it looks also into not only into short-term and not only in short-term and medium time frame, but also in long-term time frame. Another obstacle is the difference of their origins, whereby the disaster risk reduction originated from a bottom-up approach. The climate change adaptation originated more or less from a scientific community, which is more or less a kind of a top-down approach. Then the different institution mechanism, in most at the national level, we have noticed that climate change issues are handled in different ministries, as well as disaster risk reduction strategies are either developed or implemented by another ministry, which could be, in most cases, the Ministry of Defense. And also the stream of finance, where the funding is coming, is also different, also create the kind of obstacles in terms of how it is implemented at the national level. And finally, there are different spatial scales and time horizon. Most often, disaster risk is location specific, whereas climate change adaptation, it's more or less it has a kind of regional, sometimes a global scale. So what are some of the pathways that we have to ensure coherence in terms of looking at this different international agreement? First, it's more or less building capacity for policy process, because if you have a very well built, if the respective stakeholders have a broader understanding of what the policy wants to achieve, it's already set a good pathway for ensuring a kind of holistic approach in designing the politics, in designing the policy. Another pathway is also to build a kind of risk governance system, taking into consideration the key stakeholders and the different action that needs to be addressed within the respective framework. The third pathway is to have a better understanding on the climate change impact as well as the disaster risk, and also the funding strategy. It also needs to take into consideration how to better allocate the fundings between these different international agreements. Another important aspect is also in terms of selecting the adaptation strategy or the risk management measure, which also has to take into consideration ensuring that the different aspect of this different international agreement, be it the Paris Agreement, the Standard Framework, or the Sustainable Development Goal, are taken into consideration before an adaptation strategy or a risk management measure is implemented, or it's decided, or which adaptation measure is to be used for a particular hazard, be it a drought or be it flooding. And finally, it's also important to look at how implementation should be done, and there should be a monitoring to ensure that these different aspects have taken into consideration, and at the end, to also do a kind of evaluation that the measure or the management strategy put in place has taken into consideration all these different components. So what are some of the way forwards that we have, especially when we think about drought, since it's the topic for today? I mean, ongoing efforts at the national level, such as the National Adaptation Plan that I earlier mentioned, or the National Disaster Risk Reduction Strategy. These are good entry point whereby you can look in your respective strategies on how best you can integrate or build coherence between the Paris Agreement, the Sendai Framework, as well as the sustainable goals in terms of designing your policy or in terms of allocating your funding. Another also interesting way forward is the integrated drought management program, which we will learn from the next two presentations, which is more or less at the global level, and it looks into mitigating drought risk as well as building drought resilience. So I will end for now here with my presentation, and we'll come back at the end for questions, for any open question. So thank you very much for listening.
One second.
Yannick, I think you have to change to the next presentation.
Great. Thanks, Yannick, and welcome everybody. My name is Bob Stefanski. I'm head of the technical support unit, as Emmanuel said, of the Integrated Drought Management Program, and I'll get into some details about that. But this is a very, in a way, quick overview, and we'll be sharing the presentation, so there's a lot of content and links that you can explore various other aspects into. Very quickly, the two main partners, not the only ones, but the ones who help facilitate the IDMP is the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, where I work. And again, we represent the national weather services of the world and the hydrological services. And secondly, we have the Global Water Partnership, and they have many country water partnerships that also liaise and help us on this issue of integrated drought management. And I'll talk about the many partners. In fact, both of them are on the call. In fact, UNCCD and UNU. So defining drought, just very quickly. There's many different definitions, but basically drought is a deficiency of precipitation, rainfall, what we call intensity, from expected or normal, that extends over a season or longer period of time. So by this broad definition, virtually every climate experiences drought, and there's going to be some debates on whether the desert experiences drought, but that's something for the scientists to sort of argue. But still, basically it's a deficit of rainfall, precipitation from normal, that is insufficient to meet demands of human activities and the environment. These are the impacts. Again, these impacts can be on agriculture, on hydrology, on water resources, obviously socioeconomic. We're also looking at ecological impacts, which is very important. And this drought management, to be effective, must be integrated across sectors within and between levels of governments, as well as NGOs, other civil society actors, and the private sector. So again, as we mentioned here, droughts differ in terms of intensity, duration, and spatial extent. As with other natural hazards, each drought event is unique in its physical characteristics and its impacts. And I'm glad, again, Emmanuel talked about slow onset, and definitely drought is one of these. And it is something also just to contrast, in recent news in the last week or so, many tropical cyclones are hitting various parts of the world, almost, I think, 3 or 4 continents. We had the Philippines, South Asia, United States. those are very distinct events that we can really measure, and it's easy to understand, if you will. But again, since drought is a slow onset phenomenon, when does it start? When does it stop? We made some progress on that, but just keep that in consideration. Again, that drought is one of the most complex natural hazards. These impacts of drought can accumulate quite gradually, but then have a major impact as far as water resources. Again, sometimes this fuzzy definitions can lead to uncertainty on the precise timing and how to implement emergency response actions or mitigation measures. And again, connected to what Emmanuel was saying, again, droughts and floods are expected to increase due to climate change. So again, this we would always need to have integrated drought management and policies, even without climate change. But this makes this work much more pressing with the recent increases in global temperatures and the climate change impacts that we're seeing across the world. Just very quick background, and one thing I want to key on that's also, I think, relevant to what this talk is on the post-2015 environment. So we had a high-level meeting on national drought policy in 2013. And again, I want to focus on the sponsors here as WMO, UNCCD, which is Daniel's organization, and FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, and many, many other UN and national regional organizations. So keeping with these frameworks, Sendai and the other frameworks, we are trying to be as multinational and multilateral as possible. And one thing we say to countries is that, we're working at a global level, at a UN level, across disciplines. WMO deals with weather and climate, UNCCD with desertification and land neutrality, land degradation neutrality, and FAO deals with agriculture. But we can work together on a global level, and we want the same thing at a country level for our colleagues and people on the call and the workshops that we do. We know this is difficult, but it's something that can lead to a lasting plan that again meets these post-2015 agenda frameworks. Likewise, again, looking at the logos on top, again, in addition to FAO, UNCCD, and WMO, we also have the Convention for Biological Diversity. This series was done with UN Water, going on now 8 years, but these capacity development to support national drought policies. Again, a list of different workshops. All this stuff is online, and you can find it at the IDMP website. But again, the same idea of bringing everybody together at a global level to help you deal with all these issues across the different ministries and organizations at a national level. So therefore, in 2013, we had many initiatives. And so the Integrated Drought Management Program was created with the main organizing partners as WMO and the Global Water Partnership. But however, we have now over 35 partners. And of course, the main contributors are FAO, UNCCD, the World Bank, etc. Again, we have many other organizations there at a national, regional, and global level. And this is the website. Again, I'm not going to go into detail with this. You're encouraged to look at this offline. There's many tools and resources as well. So getting to the task at hand, again, from this high-level meeting, many conversations, including with Daniel and many other colleagues, we more or less have come up with 3 pillars of integrated drought management. It's in a way starting with monitoring and early warning, but then you also need vulnerability and drought impact assessments. And then you need to look at mitigation, preparedness, and response measures. And all these 3 pillars can lead to successful drought policy and plans at a national level and possibly even regional level. So I'll briefly go into the 3 pillars. So the first one, and this is the specialty of WMO, looking at the monitoring early warning systems. Again, just remember that we're monitoring the current and previous and past climate to see what the situation is now. We're also looking at the future with predictions, and this all leads to an early warning system. We also need a delivery system with this. We look at these key physical indicators, precipitation, temperature, soil moisture, etc., stream flow. Now, the key here is that these indices will help trigger actions and drought plans. And so this first pillar is very important, and that it also needs the other two pillars to augment it. So to determine what triggers on these thresholds of the indicators to be used, you need to do a vulnerability and impact assessment of the previous droughts. And there you see the various indices, indicators, and then the long range of agencies, ministries, and organizations that are needed to supplement the information. There's not a one system fits all. Each country is different. In fact, in many countries, large and small, you have different ecosystems, you have different user bases. You might have an agricultural sector, you might have a forestry sector, and you might need different indices with that. But that's where you can bring all the stakeholders to the table and come up with a coherent, national drought plan and policy. We've done some work with IDMP on developing a handbook of indicators and indices. Again, this is on the website. The other two pillars, again, looking at risk and vulnerability and impact assessment. Again, what were the past impacts and losses? A lot of countries do not have this, so it's very difficult to know how to develop a plan if you don't know what the past was. Again, coming from the weather and climate community, we always think that the weather and climate information is the least known. In fact, it's probably the best data we have. Again, talking to many people in the drought community, impact assessments and losses, it's still fairly rare to have a very good database on these impacts and losses. Again, these are critical for evaluating the progress in risk reduction and vulnerability assessments. And then you need to bring this together with preparedness, mitigation, and response. You need proactive measures to increase coping capacity. And very important is that the response measures need to support the principles of drought risk reduction. So yes, it could be very easy in the midst of a major drought to drill more, groundwater wells to access the water deep. Are you just actually making yourself, the country or region, more vulnerable to drought in the future? This is what a coherent drought plan will help to address, so you don't make yourselves, on a country basis and a national basis, more vulnerable to droughts in the future. So this is what the plan provides. And again, this is consistent, again, with Sendai and climate change adaptation and all the other frameworks. Again, it's going a bit slowly. Again, this is by sector, by area or region, and can be various different stakeholders and organizations and agencies. So over the years, we also developed some guidelines. Again, we have a 10-step process developed by Don Wilhite from the U.S. National Drought Mitigation Center. Again, this is a starting point. It's a template. It's not prescriptive. We had a case for Central and Eastern Europe. They developed a 7-step plan. This is a starting point for countries that don't know where to start and making sure that they're on the right path. Some requirements to implement national drought management policies: you need to build capacity, you need to prioritize drought in the government development policy. Again, a collaborative environment, and I can't stress this enough, within and between various levels of government, civil society, and the private sector. Strong outreach and media programs. And again, they should reflect regional differences. Again, we have a lot of material, guidelines, and a library. And actually, Daniel will talk about more of these things that are available. So just to point out, there's a lot of information available to help people at a country level to find their way on this issue of national drought policies. We also have resources on the 3 pillars, and also we have about 30 examples of national drought policies and plans. I think, and to wrap up, how is this, droughts in the post-2015 agenda, linked? And some of these things predate the post-2015 agenda, but again, for the WMO perspective, there's the Warsaw mechanism from the Climate Change Convention on quantifying loss and damage from extreme climate events. We're working on this in WMO across all the hazards. And of course, I'm working on the drought issue. And along with UNCCD, we're actually trying to develop a global drought classification scheme so countries can develop their own national drought indices, but how do we link it together at a global level? The magnitude and associated disaster losses, and again, improved monitoring and management are fundamental to both Sendai and the SDGs. And again, the effective and accurate monitoring of weather and climate information are key inputs to drought early warning, risk identification, and managing impacts. Again, I talked about what WMO is doing on identifying the different cataloging extreme weather events. Also want to plug what and support what Daniel's doing. Again, besides the Climate Change Convention, please note we also do a lot of drought work with UNCCD. Daniel will go in much more detail. And also the Convention on Biological Diversity have been a partner in the past because they deal with extreme events also. So some of the take-home messages, again, all the partners, many experts across the world, is that past drought management efforts have been reactive, and we need to move countries and regions and at a global level into proactive risk management. You manage sector impacts. Again, a collaborative approach within and between levels of government. And there is a cost of inaction and there are benefits of action, and we have some publications on that as well. So I hope this is informative, and happy to stay around and answer any questions. So I think that's the final slide. So thank you, Emmanuel and Yannick, and people online.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hoping that you can hear me. Thank you, Bob and Emmanuel. I'm just going to also elaborate on the UNCCD Drought Initiative and beyond. Okay, let me first say a few words about the UNCCD and its strategic objectives. The UNCCD launched on 5 strategic objectives, and one of the 5 strategic objectives is to mitigate, adapt to, and manage effects of drought in order to enhance resilience of populations, communities, and ecosystems. So we give emphasis on the humanity and the livelihoods, but also the ecosystems and environmental impacts of droughts. And this is one of the strategic objectives. So there is a renewed focus on supporting countries to mitigate the impacts of drought, and this is one of the new strategic objectives for the UNCCD, especially the one on drought. So some timelines on global drought initiatives. Let me say, I think Bob has already mentioned what has happened. 2013 was a game changer when it comes to drought and the global attitude or management of drought. It started in 2013 when the high-level meeting on national drought policy was launched in Geneva. And this was just, let's not treat drought as a crisis, let's treat it as a risk. What does it mean? It means that there will be more droughts, it will be more frequent, severe, so let's treat it as a risk. We need policy based on these principles of risk reduction. Bob has said a lot about it. And then as a result of that, there were 2 major foundations or maybe initiatives that were launched as a result of HMNDP, the Integrated Drought Management Program that we had a presentation on, and then the UN Water on Capacity Development Initiative. Again, this is also presented by Bob. And then in 2015, there was the Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, SDGs. So 2015 is another game changer, but the work on on drought started already ahead of SDG in 2013. At the UNCCD level, we kept on trying to work also on regions like the 2016, the first drought conference, and we had a white paper on drought resilience adaptation policy framework, DRAPA. 2017 also we had one in Latin America and the Caribbean, and then the UNCCD also launched a global drought initiative in 2017. And 2019, the country parties adopted or vote to establish an intergovernmental working group on drought. That was at COP14 in September 2019. I'm going to say a few words on that. So there is some momentum and there are major milestones going on around drought. So how large is the problem is a question. It's very, very large. And as you can see already the global map of drought hazard and vulnerability, the global hazard, you can see already for Australia, for example, or for the US, it's dark red. Drought is happening. But when it comes to the risk map for US and Australia, for example, I'm just giving an example, it's dark blue. It means there is less risk. So as you could see, this formula of risk as an arithmetic progression of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. These two countries, which are in dark blue for the risk map, have worked on their reducing exposure and vulnerability. While drought is still happening as an exogenous factor, but the risk has been reduced. And our aim at the UNCCD is making sure that there is less impact on drought to countries and to population and communities. So our approach to drought is the three key pillars that have been very well presented by Bob, and we have worked on this since 2013 with many UN organizations, including WMO and the FAO. And this has been very well presented again by Bob. Implement drought monitoring and early warning systems. Pillar 2 is on risk and vulnerability assessment. As you could see, risk is a component where the hazard, exposure, and vulnerability are the three components. And if countries could work on reducing their exposure and vulnerability, then there is a lot of chance that they could reduce their drought risk. And then the third one is on implementing measures to limit the impacts of drought. So these are the three key pillars that we keep working on supporting countries consistently. And the consistency is not only within UNCCD, but also among UN organizations because of the launch of the HMNDP. So again, this is also our approach from reactive to proactive approach. And in reactive approach, when drought strikes, you work on emergency and relief measures. You assess the impact, you recover, and you restore. This is where the story ends, the business as usual approach. But we are supporting countries to work on drought in non-drought times. As you could already see, this is a non-drought period in green, where you work on risk mitigation measures, vulnerability and impact assessment. You monitor and early warning. So these are the key proactive drought risk mitigation measures that you do in non-drought times, in order to secure that the households, livelihoods, and food security are protected and not impacted by droughts. So the UNCCD Drought Initiative was launched at COP13 in September 2017. That was a conference of parties in China, and it has three main components. One was to support countries to develop national drought plans. The other one was to also support regional efforts to reduce drought vulnerability and risk, and to also develop a toolbox to boost the resilience of people in ecosystems to drought. So the three key areas of work within the framework of this global drought initiative, and there were many partners of this drought initiative, including WMO, FAO, Convention to Biological Diversity, EU, JRC, Joint Research Center, National Drought Investigation Center of the University of Nebraska, UNEP, DHI, and also UNCCD-led. So we first developed this UNCCD-led drought toolbox. As you can see, it is built within the framework of these three key pillars. And I would encourage everyone to see and look for themselves what kind of tools are available. What the beauty of this toolbox is, it is context specific, reality specific. There is no one size fits all approach. So we need to make sure that we first ask where you are, what kind of drought vulnerabilities you have, and what are the resources in terms of geography, everything else, then trying to propose some approach in terms of managing drought. So this is a concerted effort of many UN organizations together. The UNCCD Drought Initiative had also supported about 70 plus countries to work on their national drought plans. Usually when you go to a country, you ask them, they seem to have a kind of a national drought plan, but that's how to respond to droughts. So what we are trying to do was, first of all, to increase the visibility of the drought plans. So when they sign up for this drought initiative, there should be a commitment by the high-level authority of the government. And there should also be, sometimes they might have a plan, but they bring it together, the visibility increases, it becomes a national issue. Because when it comes to drought management, to drought plans. It's under one sector, under one ministry. But when drought strikes, it becomes a national disaster. So you need to prepare at the national level. All stakeholders should be involved. So they start with a kind of a national stakeholder dialogue, bringing together everyone, even the non-usual suspects like the Ministry of Health, maybe finance, tourism, everything that will definitely be impacted by droughts. So about 50 plus countries have already completed their national drought plans, and a few of them are about to finish before the end of the year. So we were able to achieve at least this about 70, close to 70 countries who are able to develop national drought plans. And this is a game changer. Now what comes next is implementing it, but at least they have now what to do when drought strikes. So what kind of lessons did we learn from this drought initiative, having been interacting with a number of countries? One is almost every country is in its national drought plan. They keep talking about the lack of intersectoral and interministerial coordination mechanism. This means it is in one ministry or one sector, the enforcing nature of droughts is not there. So this national drought plan will help them to keep that there is a high-level authority that is going to enforce action when drought strikes. So there is some kind of a step-by-step approach on what to do before drought strikes and what to do during drought times. So this is what the national drought plan is working on. The other thing is the existing perspectives are still focused on crisis approach, which means they are still, the focus is on what to do during drought times. And there is insufficient data. We keep talking about helping countries to develop drought early warning monitoring systems to help them enrich their drought risk profiling, but there is no data. So we need to make sure that also countries are supported by having more data, because what you cannot manage, you cannot measure. So you need to first work also on data. Inadequate understanding of the cost of inaction. This has been also highlighted by Bob. The lack of political will on drought is because countries do not know, in many cases, how they are going to gain in terms of economics, because they are prepared. The benefits of action versus the cost of inaction. So this is still, there is not enough studies as far as the benefits of action versus the cost of inaction is concerned. And this will definitely help to incentivize government officials to work on drought before drought strikes. Lack of proper communication on drought early warning systems. In many cases, at the high level, they know when drought strikes, but it's not really trickled down to the local level. They don't have the information. Those who are the end users of this kind of information. So the communication is still missing. There is still emphasis on water supply mechanism, how to harness water supply through rainwater harvesting, instead of minimizing water use, instead of working on water use efficiency, for example, demand management. So there is more focus on water supply. There is a mainstreaming gender in the national drought plans is still an ongoing process. It is still weak because when drought strikes, it affects the vulnerable communities and population, which are in many cases women and children. So we need to first leverage drought as a connector among sectors. We need to make sure that every sector is aware and also part of these national drought plans. And we need to also harness the benefits of modern technology, especially for early warning systems, the artificial intelligence, mobile and remote sensing for drought resilience. So I just want to come to COP14. Drought was a very hot topic of discussion among country parts at COP14. And as you can see, Nature, the journal Nature has covered two titles on drought. African nations push UN to improve drought research, and the other one says end the drought research. And at the end of the 2 weeks discussion, it was one of the topics that needed time for countries to come up on agreement, and countries decided to establish an intergovernmental working group on drought. Why did we need, but before I go that, there was a drought preparedness day also at COP where many organizations came together. We have one full day dedicated at the conference of parties, and we launched a lot of good publications. For example, this one, which brings together the 3 key pillars, plus the 6 Sendai framework on disaster risk reduction. So it's the 3 key pillars. How do they affect So they are still trying to make sure that the 3 key pillars are good to help us achieve SDGs. They are also good enough to work on the Sendai framework. So we launched a number of good publications like how available approach and policy recommendations on assessing vulnerability and impact assessment, and the benefits of action versus the cost of inaction that was launched by IDMP and the World Bank, and the white paper on proactive approach to drought preparedness. These were all launched at COP. So now coming to the Intergovernmental Working Group, this is revolutionary and probably also a game changer for UNCCD and the global management of droughts, because the IWG, the Intergovernmental Working Group, is about 30 members. 15 are regional representatives representing their countries, but 15 world-renowned experts from every organization, academicians, UN agencies, and civil society organizations came together. They started working on this since March this year. And terms of reference as established by COP was first they are stock taking and reviewing what exists in terms of policy and implementation coordination frameworks on drought, what's out there. And then they are going to consider options for appropriate policy advocacy and implementation measures. And they are carrying out this task with a wider holistic and integrated approach because they want to make sure that UNDRR, Sendai Framework, UNFCCC, CBD, the WMO, FAO, and many others who are working on drought are part of this process. The main hypothesis is that we are so far dealing on drought resilience on a piecemeal approach, which means we are reacting. The country, it's left up to the country to declare drought emergency, and the international community reacts when drought strikes, and it's far too late and too little. So we need to make sure that there is some sort of institutionalization of drought preparedness at the global level. So the alignment of the IWG is, they have 4 IWG task groups, which are aligned with these 3 pillars. One is on looking at the policy and governance segment, trying to look what kind of global level policy and governance should we look into. How can we make sure that there is some enhanced coordination framework on drought at the global level and also at regional level? And what kind of resources and incentives are out there? Because when it comes to implementing droughts plans, it's about resources, it's about financing. So how can we harness this, and how can we create or enhance the visibility of drought in the GCF, GEF, and all the donors, their portfolios? They are looking into supporting countries on their vulnerability and impact assessment. The biggest problem with drought is that it is hidden. Countries are not able to, the direct and indirect impacts of drought are not yet very well registered by countries. So we are trying to also, how can we help countries to do that? And monitoring and early warning systems is always one of the big key pillars. Not only monitoring and early warning on drought episode, but also in the impacts, to monitor and early warning on the impacts. So subjects under discussion, as I said, policy, how can we strengthen commitment at the global level? How can we strengthen collaborative centers on drought? Maybe creating an excellence center where developing countries can tap into some kind of knowledge in non-drought times. So we need to make sure that there is some institutionalization and making sure that countries are working on drought in non-drought times. Establish a global network. How can we create the economic stimulus? How can we de-risk? Maybe encouraging the private sector on investing on drought preparedness, better financing mechanisms, and catalytic roles like the public financing or insurance or trust funds. And the vulnerability assessment is also still the mapping of drought impacts, because countries need to know some kind of drought risk profiling. They should have the kind of where are the hotspots, who is going to be vulnerable, and why, before drought strikes, so that they know where to act. When the drought strikes, there is no time to really know and get data on that. And then the monitoring, that they will go one step further on how to monitor the impacts or how to really predict the impacts of the upcoming droughts. Not only that droughts will show up in the next 6 months or so, but how will they impact? And there is also investment on technical capacities in infrastructure, but governance, stakeholder engagement, and how can we, the communication aspect especially is also missing. So this task group is also working on that. So this is a website of this Intergovernmental Working Group. If you go to our website, there is an issue on land and drought, and on that you will be able to get the Intergovernmental Working Group page where all the meeting reports, the interim report that is almost going to be published next week is there. They have already produced an interim report. This is where we are. So globally, there is some kind of work being done to make sure that there is some structured and institutionalization of drought preparedness at the global level. It is still an ongoing process, but we are on the right track. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all for your great presentations. So now we have another. Thank you all for your great presentations. So now we have another. And I can see that Bob has already been addressing some of the questions in the chat, or making questions there. So thank you very much for that. If there are any further comments or questions that any of you have, you can either put them in the chat again, or you can also click the button in the top toolbar to raise your hand, and we can let you speak in your microphone.
Yannick, if you mind, just as we're waiting, I can just sort of summarize sort of the chats, Marta and some other people, if you don't mind.
Yes, please.
So, her question was basically, let me go back now, was how to quantify loss and damage from droughts while also recording their hazard intensity, duration, intensity, especially for the pre-2000 era. It's not there yet, and I get her point about data scarce areas, but there are a number of initiatives that are going on across the drought community. Jürgen, and she mentioned this European Drought Impact, the EDII. There's several things also going on in North America with the National Drought Mitigation Center. There's nothing purely global yet. I think that we're trying to just work with, there's no initiative to do a global scale impact reporter, if you will. Again, we view all these things at a national or regional level, so we're trying to support those activities. WMO has what we call regional climate centers, and we have about 10 or 12 of those across the world that can also potentially do this. They mostly only do drought monitoring at the moment, or some of them. Also, there's something that I shared in the chat, something called Meteo Alarm, which is an attempt by the European weather agencies to put together sort of a hazard alerts, and we're working on drought. So I'll leave it at that since you have a question. So I'll stop here. Over. Oh, in fact, it's right there. That's your question. Sorry. Yeah. So that's it's an ongoing activity. Again, Jürgen from the Joint Research Center from European Commission. We've been talking along with Daniel and other people. So it's the challenge that we face, and is again supporting national activities, as Daniel has pointed out, with the drought policies, with UNCCD and among other partners, even also with an IDMP. So I just wanted to communicate to the group that we're all talking together. I mean, I've known Daniel now, yeah, I guess going on 8 to 9, 10 years, Jürgen as well. So it's a fairly small community, the drought community. And I think we've made great progress in trying to communicate to the countries a coherent message on the 3 pillars and likewise. So We've been supporting FAO and UNCCD on these African drought workshops, South American drought workshops, etc. And then we have something like CCA-DRR. We can piece together as much as we can, but again, and there are some research, there's also a question of applied research. And maybe this is a good research study. I'm trying to use some of this data, and I know, for example, Jürgen Voigt currently, along with some of us, are working very hard on the UN Disaster Risk Reduction Agency special report on drought that will come out next year that might try to address some of these issues. Again, I guess I'm more of an advocate of trying to do things at a national to regional level, because to me, that's where the decisions are. It's not to say that there aren't decisions made at a global level, but there's already mechanisms for that with things that we already do with climate events for La Nina and El Nino, et cetera. So I'll leave it there. I don't want to try to dominate the conversations. Over.
Okay, I think Emmanuel.
Yes, I have just a quick
quick questions to Daniel or Bob. If you can help me.
Okay,
I didn't hear you. Are you speaking?
If you can help me to understand a little bit how the
interaction between your organization and
well, we can trust you. Yes.
Sorry, there is. Can you hear me now? Okay, good. My question is, I just wish to understand your interaction between your organizations and at the national level, or the parties. How, if there's any example that you can give where this interaction leads to a kind of a success on the ground, in terms of when we think about this integrated drought management program. Is there an example that you can give whereby your organization interacted with the country at the national level, and this leads to a positive impact on the ground that could be used as an example for other countries to copy?
And if you look at the 3 pillars, it's sometimes hard to find. I'll put it in the chat, actually.
Websites.
So with the IDM,
Sometimes hard to
we have regional projects. And so we have a project in Central and Eastern Europe funded by the Global Water Partnership, also in
Central and Eastern Europe funded by the Global Water Partnership, also
Central Europe, Slovakia through IDMP has developed a national drought policy based on the work that was being done there. And there's many examples. I did some works in the Pacific, the Solomon Islands, and then Daniel with UNCCD, supported by many other organizations, has done a very good job in starting this process in many countries. And we still need to support that. So I think there's very concrete examples, Emmanuel. So we have examples in definitely in Central Europe. I think also some places in Africa.
Examples, Emmanuel. So we have examples in definitely in Central Europe.
FAO and UNCCD in Africa and Latin America were successful. I'll leave it to Daniel to add things.
It all. Mexico, for example, is a good example where they try to make sure that they adapt these 3 key pillars and the 10-step process, and they have successfully implemented this national drought plan, and they are even becoming a good role model to countries in the region. They keep getting invited, making sure that there is some kind of South-South exchange. Colombia is another good example where we worked on, Nigeria, and also Namibia. So there are a lot of countries that are really coming up with some initiatives. For example, Namibia has an integrated way of working on the 3 Rio conventions, making it sure that they are under one ministry. And they were really a good example for many, many countries, because when it comes to NAP, National Adaptation Plan, the national reporting, everything, it's just in one. They can really bring it together. So the government structure, they changed it according to the needs, like what you have been saying. When we are talking about drought, then it's just under one sector. So there are a number of good examples coming up. Vietnam is another good example. Many countries actually now, because of this drought initiative, we have many, many countries who have adapted this, and they are going forward with the next steps. I can give you a list of about 26 countries who have already completed, and make sure that they are also sharing it with others. It's all on our website. So what I wanted to say is, I think the consistency that we have been trying to do in terms of the 3 key pillars, the 8 to 10 step processes, really made a big difference, because countries now started to really make sure that this is the way forward, and with our regional workshops and everything else. And I believe countries learn from each other, especially countries in a region. Like Mexico, for example, it was really very inspired. It inspired many, many countries in the region. When we were in the workshop, that the guy from Mexico came out and he inspired many countries in the region. So it's always good to find a role model in one region, and then capitalizing on that to make sure that countries learn from from each other. This South-South exchange is something that we have to explore more. Thank you. I mean, there is some good questions coming from Jürgen, I think, on quantifying loss and damage from droughts while also recording their hazard intensity. This is a big challenge, because data is a big challenge. That's why we have this drought vulnerability and impact assessment methodology, because the drought is still not very well taken, or maybe it's not a priority, because the impacts of droughts are not very much appreciated. There was a new World Bank publication that brought together even the long-term indirect impacts of droughts. It's uncharted waters, it says. It was published in 2018. And it was really an eye-opener, because we think about droughts, then we just count the number of livestock dead and people who have been affected, but it's much more than that. It has a long-term effect on stagnation. Children born during drought times have retarded effects on their mental development, everything else that you think of. And this has to be very well quantified, so that we can make a difference on ensuring that government policies are serious about our investing, or maybe giving priority on droughts. Thank you. There is someone, Marta, this is our current work, okay. Thank you, I'm done.
Yeah, thank you.
And maybe just to add, as we just maybe wait for another question, again, I know I might be repeating, but, it really, I mean, I like where we are in the drought community, because exactly, WMO and will support UNCCD Drought Initiative. Likewise, if FAO has some training, we'll support that. Jürgen at the Joint Research Center, if he has a workshop, will help support that and interact with him. So, and as Daniel said, we have a lot of colleagues at a national level that provide support and examples from. So I think we're at a very good place. I think that in the chat, there's more work to be done. And I think if I had to just quickly sum up, the one pillar that needs the most work, as Mark has been indicating, is the impact and vulnerability pillar. That's the least amount of data we have, and least amount of, maybe even resources that are put to it. Over.
Right. now, comments, maybe we can round up. So if anybody would like to later on, you can use the online forum on the website. And we will look there. Otherwise, we can stay in touch. Email addresses. Yeah, I would like to say thank you to everybody for your presentations and you for joining us. Yeah, you're right.
Seems we are done. Is that the case? Hello? Hello?
Yes.
Are we done, Yannick?
Yes, I can hear you. It seems as if no further question is coming, so.
Okay. Thank you very much. We really appreciate, and yeah, let's hope for another opportunity. It was interesting. At least a good discussion. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Emmanuel, Yannick.
Yes, I can hear you.
Daniel,
It seems as if
Yannick, Emmanuel,
no
everybody
further
online
question is coming.
to
So
discuss, and I think we're available for further questions and collaboration. Yeah. No, our pleasure.
thank you very much, Bob and Daniel. I highly appreciate it. It was an interesting discussion.
Okay.
Yeah, looking for another opportunity for
Safe
collaboration.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.